So my career has been in the military. I won't tell you how many years. Formerly on active duty and currently the reserve, phasing out basically, but I'll explain that later. But I actually started really searching or researching about organizational commitment in the military. And I actually started looking at what incentives that the military can use to recruit, promote, and to retain individuals in the military. So I actually looked at some of the monetary incentives. So from that evolved information about race, because I looked at demographics like race and gender and the like. And then as a woman in the military, I kept doing more research. In fact, one of my peer-reviewed articles, I compared the challenges of being a female in academia to being a commissioned officer in the military. And ironically, I found, this was in Administration and Society, I found many shared challenges between what women go through in academia versus what particularly commissioned officers go through as women in the military. So, and I found myself doing that, and it has been a constant theme. And really in 2010, when I secured tenure, little did I know that a woman I met, Major General Jean Holm. Major General Jean Holm was the first woman, at least in the Air Force, to gain 2 stars. So, and I met her, but that was years ago, so who knew that I was even going to pursue a PhD? Who knew? And she died in 2010. And it's regrettable on my part that I didn't get the opportunity to meet her, because in my book that Dr. Paltiel cited, I was able to interview living legends who actually lived, and I call them living legends because you're still alive, lived under what was then called the combat exclusion policy, and how they survived. But despite the yoke, the oppressive yoke of the combat exclusion policy, they still made pioneering and prominent roles in the military. And my regret with not being able to interview Major General Jean Holm was that 2 of her mentees, Brigadier General Wilma Vaught and Major General Marcelite Harris, were actually 2 of the individuals of the 17 people I interviewed. That was not deliberate on my part, but it just turned out that way. So maybe they were kind of sitting in for her. That said, my research continues to evolve. And in fact, that's the reason I'm here at Carleton, to look at women primarily and how they're doing in the Canadian Armed Forces. That said, I was asked to do a presentation about the U.S. military, so titled Women in the U.S. Military, and it was actually, the title was not mine, it was actually Dr. Paltiel, Gender Hierarchy and Discipline in a Warrior Culture. So having said that, what are the 3 factors that determine whether cultures actually go to war? There are actually 3. One is 2-pronged. One is called patrilocal, meaning that the degree to which a spouse resides with her husband, or wife resides with her husband. And matrilocal, the degree to which a woman, a wife, resides, or a male rather, resides with his wife. So that's about residency. The second is really the geographical proximity that individuals who are married, men and women, reside with their families. The third is whether or not these individuals share a culture. whether it's language or anything else. The more distinct the cultures are, the greater the likelihood that there will be warfare. Okay? Just decided to throw that out in terms of war. And particularly women who reside with their husband's family, or even with their own families, have more challenges in the sense that their husbands are more likely to go to war with their male relatives. So they're kind of caught in between. So, are women in the military compatible? Well, when you think of women, women connote supporters, women connote caretakers, women connote weakness, and even sex fiends, unfortunately. Women are perceived as biologically compromised. Why? According to Simons and Manninger, they are not physically fit. They cannot endure the arduous rigors or the rigors of war. Their physical frame is such that they're not built for the rigors of war. In fact, Jeffries basically said, if women put themselves in these situations, they're basically asking for it because the military and thus war is incompatible with women. Petronio. Petronio is a captain in the Marines. She wrote an article called, I'm trying to think of, Get Over It. We're not equal. What's interesting about her as a Marine is the fact that, and particularly as a female Marine, is the fact that the Marines were one of the first to embed women in operations Iraqi and Enduring Freedom. And she, Petronio, she advised commanders on how best to integrate women into combat. She herself has logged impressive hours in terms of her work in the field and in combat. So it's kind of interesting. I don't know if she was basing the fact that women do not possess the physical rigors or the physical ability to endure combat based upon her own experience or not. But as a Marine, it's a telltale sign that of all the people and a Marine, that she would say that. Women get pregnant, men don't, obviously. What's the saying? If it was up to men to get pregnant, we wouldn't have a population. So women do get pregnant because women are the species that has been selected by powers be to be the repository, basically, to have children. So women do get pregnant. There are cultural proclivities that reinforce this myth. So Snyder basically says that women, like men, have to be socialized to be warriors. Men aren't brought up to be warriors. In other words, they are not naturally warriors. So they have to be socialized. Ellefson basically says that this is the case. Goldstein says that's the case. And Wagner Ducreux says the same thing. In fact, Goldstein particularly looks at women heads of state and really shows someone like Corazon Aquino of the Philippines, who survived 7 assassination attempts. She volleyed, knowing that as a woman, she volleyed very expertly between being effeminate when she would speak to her the population, and she would speak in the local tongue, Tagalog, and she would speak very effeminately. Whereas when she needed to restrain the military, her rhetoric was very bellicose. As I said in my 2015 book, women are naturally warriors. We are warriors to the core. As Grandpa said, that women and war are inextricably linked. Others describe the truth about women and war, as I said, Goldstein and Bhutto, who was the first Muslim female to be the head of Pakistan. She survived three assassination attempts, and she even ran her party in exile. These are interesting individuals. In contemporary times, Mazur talks about something that's called the novelty effect. Why the novelty effect? She says that the reason why women are considered novel is because if they're not seen in certain venues, so you don't see female pilots in combat, you don't see engineers and the like. So as a result, when you see a woman doing something that is non-traditional, it tends to call attention to the media. And so she calls it the novelty effect. But little do we know that, I wear retainers so it gets dry. Little do we know that throughout, at least since the 1960s, the U.S. Air Force has had women stationed all throughout the U.S. in bunkers underground. And women's responsibility was really to person, as I would call it, the ICBMs, the intercontinental ballistic missiles. So their role was basically to thwart the enemy should the enemy launch their missiles. So women have always been in combat in the U.S. I then advanced Mazur's theory, the novelty effect, to a theory of attrition. And why did I call it a theory of attrition? Charles Moskos, an art historian, you'll never hear me say herstory or history. I would say outstory. O-U-R-S-T-O-R-Y. So I look at Charles Moskos, an historian, who looked at data in the U.S. Army and showed that there was a propensity for white women to prematurely separate from the military for several reasons. One of which included sexual harassment, sexual assault, and the like. So I took his data. In fact, I emailed him. He's no longer here, alive. And I took his data with his permission, and I analyzed it. And I came to the conclusion that even though particularly white women is the segment of the military population that is most supportive of women in combat, or women in still non-traditional jobs, they are the most likely to prematurely separate from the military, not because they necessarily want to, but they believe that the environment is so hostile, whether it's because of sexual assault, whether it's because they feel sex discrimination, whatever it is, so they leave. My argument with that is, yes, it is negative for the military, but at the same time, it really demonstrates that white women were simply exercising full agency. So they're in a struggle for full agency. So while it's negative for the military, it's not necessarily negative for society. That said, I argue that it behooves the military not to alienate the group that supports combat, or women in combat the most. That they should do all that they can to woo them. I also looked at, I also came up with what is called theory of multiple marginality. I was looking at diversity, really. And what I discovered is there were several barriers or several factors that formed and what is called an intersectionality that reinforced each thing that women did in organizations. And here are the 8 barriers. One of the reasons why organizations do what they do it because of symbolism, so they won't face any backlash. Secondly, handling their own kind, so they put certain women in certain jobs because women know it best, whatever that best is. But unfortunately, the third, what it does is it reinforces women's marginalization, just as it reinforces minorities being marginalized. It also is a diminution of power for women. It's similar to what an American scholar, Henderson, he dubs the Detroit syndrome, which basically is discount them, you demote them, you devalue them, and then you dump them. That's basically, really, it sounds horrible, it's basically what it is. Also, silencing the critics. 6, it's the purview of women and thus the absolution of white males. That's a woman thing. We don't need to get involved. 7, lack of actionable commitment from leadership. And the leadership's rhetoric is that we're committed, but the actions speak differently than they're really not committed. And finally, starve the program. If you create a program and you don't provide it with the necessary resources, it will fail, right? But you are providing it with resources, giving under the guise that you want it to succeed, when you know full well that you don't want it to succeed. So it's a pretense. So basically that was the theory of multiple marginality. So who has a monopoly in warfare? When you look at the US military, it has several philosophers, and it adopts one called, his name is Karl von Clausewitz. I'm sure some of you are familiar with his work. And his masterpiece called On War. Now, as a military person myself, going to whether it's squadron officer school as a junior officer, going to Air Command and Staff College as a mid-level officer, or going to Air War College as a senior level officer, we're ensconced in Karl von Clausewitz and On War. That said, Shane said, well, yeah, that might be the case, but was this masterpiece actually written by Karl? Or was it written by Marie von Clausewitz, his wife?
Because it wasn't done when he died.
What was that?
The book wasn't done when he died.
Ah, yeah. Okay, so who had to finish the piece? And the only credit that she's given is that she wrote the preface. But when you look at some of the verbiage that she has written, it kind of gives cause for pause as to who actually wrote the book. And when you look at the fact that, given the time, the protocol of the time, for instance, who gets the credit? Okay, I'll go back to the next one. So she was only given credit for the book's preface, was a masterpiece, was published after his death. But Shane, as I said, inserted doubt as to who completed the book. So it's not inconceivable that the entire book was actually written by Marie, not Karl. Given Karl's exploits, the sentiments of the times, because she's a woman, and as an ode or parting gift to preserve her husband's legacy. And no doubt her husband would come and would talk to her about what he did, and she is this lowly woman, I mean not lowly, but she is this woman basically is seen as a supportive spouse, and that's all she did. And the reason why they cast doubt, or Shane cast doubt as to actually who completed the work, is because when asked, she said, nevertheless, their publication, meaning the book, called for a good deal of work, arranging of material, and consultation, and I'm profoundly grateful to several loyal friends for their assistance in their task. She was very submissive and did not want to give herself a morsel of credit. So who actually wrote on war? Whether you think it's Carl or Marie, there's some doubt that has now been inserted in your mind. So who has the monopoly on war? So the literature suggests, as I said, an intersectionality between cultural and a woman getting pregnant, biology. So pregnancy may preclude a woman from engaging in war. But Adams says that may be the case. So when women become pregnant, it then forces men to do the hunting and the gathering. That in itself, because they're only pregnant for certain times in their lives, that in itself does not preclude them from going to war. As well, Wesley Segal said that's ridiculous. Women are only pregnant during certain times of their lives, just like men only fight during certain times of their lives. Not only that, she says, if certain groups have the propensity to get the flu, does it mean then you should exclude all members of those groups from partaking in a particular activity because some individuals within those groups get the flu? The same thing with pregnancy. Because only women can get pregnant, are you then going to exclude them from combat roles because they get pregnant? Cultural amnesia. The military, at least the US military, has an uncanny knack to, each time after we have surpassed a crisis, a war, the US military has an uncanny knack of, when women then ask for their due credit, the US military then wants to study it, wants to ruminate about it. Well, we're not sure yet. Without the women who are called to arms to help in this fight, this crisis, whatever it is, we couldn't have won the war. So it's kind of interesting that each time this happens. And as a result, Wesley Segal says that is the reason why women's growth in the US military has not been unilinear. It has basically been stops and starts, because each time women should, when there's peacetime, this cultural amnesia takes root and women can't advance as men do. Women, like men, as I said before, according to Snyder, have to be socialized as men are, as warriors. And as Jeffrey said, bringing women into this kind of situation is basically making them exploits for foe and friend alike, which is not necessarily the case, but that is what I should say. So I just want to give you an example of what I'm saying is not, the ouster is scant, but nevertheless, we have enough information on record to show how powerful women are and how powerful women continue to be. So, women leaders have consistently demonstrated the gravitas to intimidate any man who is considered a warlord of his time. As heads of state, they exercise strategy and savvy. They engaged in territorial expansion. They wielded influence. They embroiled their countries in justifiable wars, and they concentrated wealth and power. Jones refers to the continent of Africa as the mother of all nations, and believes that, according to the first known philosopher, Herodotus, said that the Amazons of the north, the continent of Africa, produced the Amazons of the north and the south of the continent. And as a result, the descendants, the Greek Scythians, they were in societies where, by today's standards, the roles would be considered non-traditional. Basically, women freely assumed equal roles as men, and the roles were basically reversed. Men functioned primarily as protectors, whereas women were the influencers and holders of power. So I want to share with you, this is what many, of all the female rulers of ancient times, there is one from 9th century BC, Shamuramat of Assyria. And she said, "Nature made me a woman, yet I have raised myself to rival the greatest men. I swayed the scepter of Minos. I extended my dominions to the river Hinamenis eastward, to the southward to the land of frankincense and myrrh, northward to Sakai and the Scythians. No Assyrian before me had ever seen an ocean, but I have seen 4. I have built dams and fertilized the barren land with my rivers. I have built impregnable walls and roads to far places, and with iron-cut passages through mountains where previously even wild animals could not pass. Various as were my deeds, I have yet found leisure hours to indulge myself with friends." And the reason why this is important is because she is an example of what women of her time were like. She was basically the average powerful woman in her day. And she commemorated the bronze statue to herself and her exploits. Now, what would we say today if a woman did that? We would think that, well, she's pretty, a man would be considered ambitious. A woman would be considered what? Pretty conceited, if she's going to leave that kind of legacy, right? Well, that's what she did. Other notable leaders, for instance, Egyptian Queen Hatshepsut. She was a consummate businesswoman. Other women during Ramses II of Egypt, they served as chariot riders. And the reason why they did and they used women is because women had the ability to be pretty skillful in targeting their foes. But you could tell they were women because they struck an effeminate pose. And when you looked on their ankles, you could see jewelry. So you knew that they were women. And ironically, what's interesting is, to show wisdom, many of these women donned beards, which is kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? So it's kind of interesting. But and they also donned male clothing, which ironically, their modern women actually did. But I want to give an example. In around the 16th century, Queen Zynga Mbandi, her father, the king, Mdongo, was captured. And she went to the Portuguese king in an attempt to negotiate her father's release. So when she went in the king's court, she saw the king seated, not the king, the Dutch governor, seated on his throne, and saw his attendants standing, and she's wondering, well, where am I going to sit? So, because she's of royal lineage and she behaves accordingly, she goes, and what does she do? She orders one of her attendants on all fours, sits on him, recognizing that in order for her to negotiate, she needs an eye-to-eye level playing field. So she sits on him, and then she starts to negotiate her father's release. I just thought it was so interesting. So, with all this power then, what happened to women? There was a slow but deliberate devolution of women's power. It's surmised by Grant de Paul between the end of the 11th century and 15th century. There was a so-called Age of Enlightenment. There was also a period, interestingly enough, it coincided, and Grant de Paul still doesn't know this. And if we could only if we could go back in time, but we can't. But there was a confluence of factors where the introduction of Christianity and also trying to fight against the Muslims. During this period, there was also a spat of intolerance and also hyper-morality. And there was also belief that the presence of women, particularly with men going to war, it made them soft and weak. Women were unfortunately reduced to merely accompanying men on expeditions and basically acting as pseudo-men by dressing in clothes. Now, having said that, many women also accompanied their husbands. But also, unfortunately, some were there as what we call now comfort women. And unfortunately, as you well know, the devolution of women's status still continues today. So let's talk about the American experience as far as women warriors. So Lucy Brewer, during the War of 1812, she was considered to be the first Marine, woman Marine. She served for 3 years on aboard the ship, the USS Constitution, for 3 years as George Baker. Now, I don't know how for 3 years you can go, she's a woman, she wasn't discovered, maybe they knew but they didn't know, but for 3 years. Sarah Borginnis, in 1846, she was a Confederate spy, and as a result, actually, her spying led to the Confederate Army's victory, but she was imprisoned for it. Rosie O'Neill, the same thing. Molly Pitcher, interestingly enough, I don't know if you know, anyone here knows about New Jersey, anything about New Jersey? Okay. When you go to New Jersey, the famous thing you'll hear about New Jersey is the New Jersey Turnpike, because it goes straight through from one end of the state to the next. And when people ask, well, where do you live? Usually normally say, well, I live off this exit. That's a gauge to kind of give folks as to where to go or where you live. That said, there is exit right off exit 7A. There's Molly Pitcher rest stop. And Grant DePaul is very critical of this because this is a woman in 1778 who's purported to have held the regiment intact because her husband, John Hayes, supposedly, still not sure as to who Molly Pitcher is, but she did exist, that she defended the 7th Pennsylvania Regiment and until someone could relieve her, and she took up arms, and this was in 1778. The problem that Grant DePaul has is the fact that if Molly Pitcher had been a man, he would not have been consigned to a mere rest stop of the New Jersey Turnpike. That's her criticism. Harriet Tubman, who has been described as the Moses of her people. During the American Civil War, as you well know, Harriet Tubman single-handedly and repeatedly went back into the trenches and rescued hundreds of slaves and led the Union Army and led them through to freedom through the now infamous, or no, famous, Underground Railroad. And according to Hall, he described her as, Harriet Tubman was an extraordinary human being and possibly the most underrated and underappreciated person of either sex or any race from the Civil War period. Women's othering. So we know about these wonderful American women, only 4 I've captured, and there are hundreds of them. So women have been described as deviants. When you think of deviance, you think of abnormal, away from the norm, not in the mainstream, particularly minority women. And as far as the United States is concerned, when we think of minority women, we think of individuals who are considered Asians. When we think of, well, Asians and other groups. But then within that category, we also have what is called underrepresented minority women. So you think of black women or African Americans, Hispanics, which in itself is not a race, it's an ethnicity, and also Native American women. They're considered underrepresented, not only because of the representation within the general civilian population, but in terms of in society, where they are represented largely. So Frankenberg describes how women have been considered as others. we are considered subordinate. And it's also born of the colonialistic mentality as well. When you look at work by Cantor, I'm sure you're familiar with Rosa Beth Moss Cantor's work, and she argues that if women are able to increase their representation in organizations by more than 15%, critical mass, then they'll be able to seem as if they're a part of the organization. But what she didn't tell you is that given the times, this was in the 70s, early 70s that she did her work, according to Yoda and others like Rosen et al., it's not just about the numbers, it's about the perception of the group. If the group is perceived as an outgroup, in this case women or other groups, then regardless of what they do, for instance, when you look at organizations where you look at minority women or underrepresented minority women and white women, you would think that because of kinship, that they would be more likely to integrate. That's not the case. If anything, they're more likely to be against each other, which is unfortunate. The behaviors, unfortunately, then become self-reinforcing in that women themselves practice the same behaviors. It reinforces, as Troda says, an hegemonic masculinity. Byrd Franke quotes Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, by saying their maleness, in fact, has to be underwritten by preventing women from entering some field or performing some feat. Golden has coined the term pollution theory to describe what men do to prevent women, i.e. from getting in combat, what men do to prevent women from getting in certain occupations. So she uses the example of firefighters. She said that one of the reasons why still today you have few firefighters is because men view these occupations and jobs as very prestigious. To have women is to pollute, thus pollution theory, is to pollute the occupation. So men do all that they can, like combat, to maintain the exclusivity, that is maleness, and prestige. It is akin to what I call, and what we call in my co-authors, a man cave. You know, we've got to have our own, like women don't need a women cave, or something similar. And Prentice and Carranza look at descriptive versus prescriptive stereotypes. So a descriptive stereotype would be, this is what women do. Women are nurturers, and women are kind, etc., etc. Women are weak. Prescriptive stereotypes are particularly for those things that women aren't doing, what they're supposed to be doing. Women should be kind. Women should be meek, etc., etc. The military, a double and triple jeopardy for women. The American male in the American military, the American male in American society, is described as a consummate and the self-anointed warrior. According to Kerber, the reason why women in the military, or women in any non-traditional job for that matter, or occupation, and in this case the military, and particularly combat, are considered incompatible is because it profoundly disturbs the sexual order. Women in the military are therefore incompatible. A violation of perceived cultural norms. And it reinforces women as deviants. They're away from the norm. Women then, according to Snitow, become conceptual men. Unfortunately, in the military, before the repeal of the don't ask, don't tell, and don't pursue policy, otherwise known as DADT, individuals engaged in lesbian baiting. So if a woman was approached by a fellow military person and she was not receptive, she was considered to be a lesbian. Also reinforces multiple marginalities, as I said. Silva, interestingly enough, did a study with women in, I don't know if you're familiar with the Reserve Officer Training Corps and what that is. Are you familiar with that?
Probably, probably not.
Okay. I have to remember where I am also. The Reserve Officer Training Corps, this is a way for the military to enter academic institutions like this one, for instance. This is the U.S. military. And this is a way to commission college graduates, but while they're being indoctrinated in all things military, they're also in college. Does that make sense? Just called the Reserve Officer Training Corps. In fact, many of the military branches in the U.S. would station some of their personnel there as commanders and the like. So this is a kind of a way for an individual to actually kill two birds with one stone. You get your college education, and you also get your commission in a branch in the military. In this case, Silva analyzed data and found out, interestingly enough, that women who wanted to demonstrate that they were as strong as a man didn't realize that they were engaging in kind of a mental negotiation with themselves as to, well, I don't want to be too feminine here, but at the same time, I don't want to be seen as too male-like. And the male, particularly this was an all-white male group that she analyzed, didn't know what she was talking about because they didn't have to go through these head games, basically. And the women, interestingly enough, weren't aware that they were actually going through it, even though the interviews that she held with them actually showed that they were going through this, game playing or mind playing with themselves. And really what it does, it restricts, as I said, full agency, and as well, the U.S. Solaro, a journalist, describes how the American military treats its women as a convenience workforce in the sense as how a married man treats his mistress. In other words, only call for her talents when needed. When not needed, put her aside. Everybody knows the secret, but no one is willing to acknowledge it. And when the woman, meaning in this case it's a proxy for women in the military, mounts her argument each time why she should be recognized, the military, meaning the married man, always mounts his defense, I'll study it. We have to wait, we have to see. And what it does, as I said, it restricts women's full agency, and it also compromises what is the true definition of citizenship. Marginalized yet accountable, the rationality of the combat exclusion policy. It was originally created as the Women's Armed Services Act of 1948. But in the act itself, when you look at the verbiage, inherently it was designed to subordinate women to the will of men. For instance, women could not constitute more than 2% of the military. One. Of that 2%, women could not be, no more than 10% of women could be officers. 3, women could not command men. 4, men and women had to be separate. So all these different things. 5, women could only be in a certain rank. They could not be beyond a certain rank. So the Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948, ironically, it coincided with President Truman's integration of blacks in the military. It's really, though, how women are being treated in the military, and actually in society, quite frankly, is a problem of the U.S. Constitution. When you look at the U.S. Constitution, women aren't in it. They are. And in fact, there is a famous, there's a case in 1873 where Myra Colby Bradwell, a woman from Vermont, who, for whatever reason, she decided to relocate to Illinois, and in doing so, she decided to apply for a license as an attorney. And the reason why she did so was in 1868, one of the Reconstruction laws, or one of the Reconstruction amendments, the 14th Amendment, which is the Equal Protection Clause, or the Equal Protection Amendment, basically was passed. So she figured, okay, if this is the equal protection clause under the states which say you've got to protect all of your citizens, then let me apply because I'm just like any citizen. Well, she applied. She was denied by the Illinois court, went all the way up, and then finally she decided to have her case adjudicated by the U.S. Supreme Court. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court basically, unfortunately, in 1873, decided to uphold the law. And this is what they said. They said, the High Court said, the natural and proper timidity and delicacy which belongs to the female sex, is evidently unfit. It unfits it for many of the occupations of civil life. It makes it unfit. The paramount destiny and mission of a woman are to fulfill the noble and benign offices of wife and mother. This is the law of the Creator. And believe it or not, the thinking is still the same. There's another case, the United States versus Schrimmer. And the reason why this is important in 1928 is because to show you not just the irrationality, the hypocrisy really of the law, where a woman, Rosika Trimmer from Hungary, she came to the United States, she was invited to lecture. And in 1923, she decided to apply for her naturalization because she felt, even as a pacifist, that the values of democracy in the United States comported with her own. That said, one of the questions posed was, as a citizen, would you be willing to bear arms? She said no. And because she said no, they denied her naturalization. And she said, well, that doesn't make sense because I can fulfill my civic life, my civic duty in many other ways other than bearing arms. Yet, she was then 50, so she couldn't have been in the military anyway. That's the hypocrisy. And of course, as a woman, but yet they're going to deny her citizenship based upon that question. You see? Hypocrisy? All right. So what is the combat exclusion policy? The combat exclusion policy basically says this: women cannot be in positions of direct ground combat. What does that mean? It depends. And that's the problem. It depends. And plus the irrationality of the policy. And I'll read to you something as to why it is irrational. So, then Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General McPeak, which is the irony is, guess what? Jean Holm, I think I told you, the first woman who was promoted there, she was from Portland, Oregon. Guess where General McPeak decided to retire? Portland, Oregon. I just found it interesting. Anyway, so then Senator Cohen, who became the Secretary of Defense, said, suppose you had to General McPeak, suppose you had a woman pilot of superior intelligence, great physical conditioning in every way. She was superior to a male counterpart vying for a combat position. Would you personally, because you would not want to see the risk of life increased? I have to put my glasses on. What do you think? It's your lighting. Oh, that's better. Would you personally, because you would not want to risk to her life increase, pick the male over the female under these circumstances? McPeak replied, that is correct. Senator Cohen said, so in other words, you would have a militarily less effective situation because of a personal view. McPeak said, well, I admit it. It doesn't make much sense, but that's just the way I feel about it. The former Marine Corps Commandant General Robert Barrow, he was even more emotional. He said, exposure to danger is not combat. Being shot at, even killed, is not combat. Combat is finding, closing with, and killing or capturing the enemy. It is killing, and it's done in an environment that is often as difficult as you can possibly imagine. Extremes of climate, brutality, death, dying, it's uncivilized, and women can't do it. nor should they even be thought of as doing it. The requirement of strength and endurance render them unfit to do it. And I may be old-fashioned, but I think the very nature of woman disqualifies them for doing it. Women give life, sustain life, nurture life. They don't take it. This was only in the 1990s, folks. Scary, isn't it? Real scary. All right. So that's the irrationality of the policy. Major General Gene Holm really describes the policy as when Humpty Dumpty was rebuked by Alice through the looking glass for speaking in parables. In other words, the same things mean different things whenever I want it to mean different things. Okay? So basically, the combat exclusion policy became a moving target. It constituted whatever the services deemed necessary. For instance, the Holy Grail in the Navy, the U.S. Navy, being assigned on ships. So women could actually, while the Navy allowed women to fly as fighter pilots, and they could actually land on ships, delivering supplies, delivering personnel, what have you, or even as fighter pilots, they couldn't be assigned to squadrons on ships. The Air Force, so the Air Force's Holy Grail is being a combat fighter pilot. Women were exempt from that. So basically what the different services did, and of course the Marines, everything is combat, so women can't be there. And the Army, well, that's another thing. The point of the matter is, the services very cleverly, they defined whatever combat meant to them because there was no standardization across the services. Okay? And as Oestreicher said, a truth universally acknowledged that a woman might produce books or babies, but not both. Just as she might organize her life around marriage or career, but not both. The backlash, the problem of asymmetry. When you treat different groups differently, over time, they will be accepted as different. As Yoder, as other researchers have said, basically, it's really about the numbers. Bias occurs not necessarily because of the individuals, but because over time those individuals have been treated in kind, and as a result, they not only they act accordingly, but they're treated accordingly. In fact, Steele has dubbed a theory called the stereotype threat, which means that a particular group does all that it can, including women, do all that it can to overcome a particular stereotype about themselves, only to sabotage themselves and thus reinforce that stereotype, whatever that stereotype is. So what did Living Legends have to say to me? Ironically, the oldest person I interviewed at the time was 94. She was a pilot. She was one of the first cohorts of pilots in the American military, and I was very honored to be in her presence. I interviewed her at her home, and she had in her living room a propeller of the P-51 plane, which I just thought was very interesting. She said, however, men and women shouldn't be together. I said, why not? Because, you know, when you put men and women together, only problems will come about. Yet there are the women who feel that the combat exclusion policy is, at the time, is something that has just passed its time. It's no longer applicable because the nature of war has changed, definitely. And even if the nature of war had not changed, there's no reason for the combat exclusion policy. As a result of this asymmetry, you have had sexually related offenses. They're unprecedented. So, for instance, the SAPRO, I can never remember what the SAPRO, but it's Sexual Assessment Prevention, I forgot what the R is, office. In 2012, over the 2011 figures showed a dramatic increase in the number of sexually related offenses. Now, these are the reportable offenses. These are not the actual offenses, so keep that in mind. And as a result, RAND also ran a study of over 500,000 troops and also found an increase in terms of the sexually related offenses in the military. And more recently, Borelli also recommended that, in fact, 2017, based upon 2016 numbers, that because it's the U.S.'s Congress' responsibility to create the military, therefore it is now the U.S. Congress's responsibility to oversee sexually related matters in the military. The enemy, unfortunately, no longer resides on the battlefield. The enemy is also in the military. So women are basically, and some men, are fighting on two fronts. They're fighting on the battlefield as well as with their own. And when you look at stories by two authors, Monahan and Needle Greenlee, it shows how when you've got operations in Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom, how the rate at which sexually related offenses occur are just multiple times just exacerbated. Okay? According to Brigadier General Wilma Vaught, whom I interviewed as part of my 2015 book, there's a movie, a documentary called The Invisible War, When Does It End? And really, this was probably the first time it gave the public a bird's eye view as to really what the level or the prevalence of sexual, not just sexual harassment, that's mild in comparison to sexual assault, which when you think of sexual assault, it's rape. Now, there are three different types, at least as the military looks at it, sexual assault, there are three different types. One is what is called penetrative, one is non-penetrative, and the other one is partially penetrative. And then you've got sexual harassment, which constitutes quid pro quo. In other words, I do this for you, you do this for me. And the other one is called hostile work environment, which is actually recognized in employment law as it is so pervasive, it is so severe that I can't get my work done. Just can't. So the military, unfortunately, is an environment where sexual assault, it appears. I don't want to say, because I realize this is also being recorded. The military is also an environment, it appears, where sexual assault thrives. Unfortunately, it is also a culture of domination and entitlement. So the commanders, they set the tone. Monahan Greenfield says, and that is true, when I put CCs, commanders. There are challenges of rhetoric. I say you should not. Versus training. So the Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute, which is the defense arm that does all these different kinds of training, or the individual units. So I have training. So the rhetoric, I say don't. Training should reinforce the rhetoric. But then there's practice, but I turn a blind eye. So exactly what is it? So when I turn a blind eye, the rhetoric and the training are for naught. Okay? Problems with the commanders being judge, jury, and executioner in the sense that they can overrule counsel. Why? Interestingly enough, they're also subject to the same rules in the military. You probably, I'm sure you've heard about the bipartisan support that failed. Senator Gillibrand and McCaskill and several other individuals. In fact, you had 46 senators with a bipartisan support where the military has such an undue influence over the civilian leadership that it failed. So what they wanted to do, they wanted to remove commanders altogether from the adjudicatory process, whereby once it goes to a certain level, you have unrestricted versus restricted, where when it goes to command, when it is adjudicated, the commanders are out of the process, and with high-ranking attorneys in the military who are not in the same chain of command as these commanders. But it failed. It also showed shortcomings with the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Almost 50 years ago, Sherman also talked about, it's interesting that militaries in Europe actually decided to subsume their military laws under civilian laws, yet the United States military hasn't. what the UCMG unfortunately has shown, that there's certain things that it just can't do or may not be willing to do. Okay? It's also a failure of the civilian courts to intervene as appropriate. The civilian courts in several cases have said, no, the UCMJ, the military has their own legal system. We don't want to intervene. Yet, when you look at the oustree of the military, the civilian courts have intervened repeatedly when they believe it was necessary. So I don't know why, given the prevalence or given the epidemic rates of sexual assault or sexually related offenses, why the civilian courts have decided not to intervene. I don't know. So this kind of shows you just a bird's eye view of what asymmetry creates when you've got a second-class citizenship being created without, whether deliberately or not deliberately, where, for instance, the Marine Corps, 7% of the women have experienced sexual assault, and so on and so forth. Just want to give you a bird's eye view. And this is based upon a fiscal year. Fiscal year runs from October the 1st through 1 year through September the 30th of the following year. So are women perceived as the enemy? We don't know. But given masculine domination, experiences with the Pakistani army, Vietnam conflict, the conflict in Bosnian Herzegovinian conflict shows you that, unfortunately, pornography, for instance, or sexually related offenses against women have been normalized. So because they've been normalized in the general civilian society, it's exacerbated when you go in the military. In fact, what the Pakistani army used to do, they would deliberately show men pornography to get them all built up to thwart the enemy. As I said, when you look at, I don't know if you're familiar with rape of the Nankin. Okay, what rape of the Nankin? The Japanese soldiers who raped both men and women, but especially women who were gang raped, said that they had the moral high ground. They were representing the emperor. Therefore, this is something that they should do because they consider the Chinese to be inferior. The Marines Unite, Lioness also showed in terms of female engagement teams, and embedded women in the military. Marines United, you might be aware of this, where Marines illegally uploaded very salacious material about their fellow colleagues. Interestingly enough, this was the tipping point. So you've got the repeal of the combat exclusion policy. You've got the repeal of the don't ask, don't tell. And now you can have transgender in the military. And the Marines are saying, this is just a tipping point. We can't bear this anymore. In other words, they believe that women should not be in the military. The greatest threats to men, according to Hunter: 1, competent women. 2, lesbian women. 3, gay men. What's the common thread? Women. And Brown talks about, the fragility of men. How, whether it's economic, social, political upheavals, that men usually, they adjust, but there's a fragility about men, whereas Kimmel said, when the going gets tough, the tough runs away. So where do women stand? Quickly, in active duty, you've got about almost 15% in the enlisted corps, commissioned corps, about 16%, total about 15%. This is active duty. This is now the reserve component. Shows enlisted corps almost 16%, commissioned corps, interestingly enough, almost 19%, total 17%. Shows you where the grades are. So the top, what we call top 3. In the Army, you have almost 13%. The top grades at the commission level, meaning the generals, brigadier general, all the way to 4-star general, about 6% in the Army. The Navy, you see the Marines, the Air Force, the total Ds. The Marines at the the Marines is the lowest by design. The Marines deliberately used to have a cap that women cannot constitute more than 7%. That's it, of their force. But what's happening now, because of retention problems, despite the scandal, the Marines United scandal, the Marines are deliberately courting women. They're deliberately going to high schools because we want high quality recruits with women who, pursue sports, things like that, because they need women now. These are the Constitution. This is now the reserve component of the military. Sorry that I'm having to go so fast. So, notable achievements, I'm going even faster. There have been a record number of female, 4-star female promotions, which is great, but you wonder why. But that's good. You have women's entry into what is called the silent service submarines. That's something that the Navy said will never happen, but it did. Women now at the helm, G.L.A, she's at the helm, first woman in the Air Force of Combat Fighter Wing. You have women's completion, Army Ranger School. You have now an accelerated move by former Secretary of Defense, Carter. We don't know what's happening now with the new Trump administration because the Trump administration is okay. So, the role of the Military Leadership Defense Commission and the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services recommended that the services need to be more strategic when they draw down from Operations Enduring and Iraqi Freedom. Now that we've got Operation New Dawn, they need to be more mindful because we're losing women, particularly we don't see women at the senior levels in both the enlisted and the commission corps. So what's the motivation? Because we don't have the men. So we're losing the men. So we have to turn, according to what Patton and Parker et al. Said, now we have to turn to women. In fact, Iskra talked about, in fact, she was the first woman to command a ship in the Navy. She was part of my, one of the women I interviewed as well. She said, one of the reasons why the Navy turned to women in the academy for the submarines, we would never do that, is because not enough men are graduating in the technical fields for submariners anymore, and simultaneously more women are pursuing more technical degrees. Okay. So we know the motivation. There's a great deal of resistance, particularly by the Marines, continues to be. What's the role of external groups like the Service Women's Action Network, ACLU, protectors of our defenders, to keep DOD's feet, the Department of Defense, keep their feet to the fire in terms of full implementation of the combat exclusion policy. Okay. So, the road forward. This is the last slide, folks. The road forward. Women's place in U.S. society must be framed according to the following. Women represent 51.9% of your population. This was almost, 7 years ago in the last census. Why would you subordinate, why would you marginalize half of your population? 2, women are an invaluable resource. 3, it is of compelling government interest to do so. 4, it's a matter of readiness. 5, leverage the full talents of your population. 6, right to bear arms as American citizens. 7, right to full agency. 8, it is indisputable and consistent. Women have shown stellar performance in the military. Women have and continue to exceed performance and commitment expectations. Gender should be moot. It helps to meet recruitment, promotion, and retention goals of the military. And finally, it reinforces democracy and those values that are associated with democracy. And basically what President Carter said, equal obligation deserves equal rights. Thank you for your time.